Okay, the recording has started, and this is the October 1st, 2019 Crossplane community meeting. The first thing that I wanted to mention today is that since the last community meeting, we have made a release of this v0.3 release. Went out, I think it was a day after the last community meeting. So that's definitely a celebration and a success there for the whole team here in the community here. So we wrote a blog post that I linked in the agenda document here. That's kind of an overview of the things that were in the release, and you should expect to see more blog posts coming out over the next few weeks with more details about all the cool features and accomplishments and things that we were able to build in the 0.3 release. So there should be regular blog posts coming out pretty soon. Okay, so good job to everybody on that. We also ran a retrospective event about the 0.3 release, and we made that public as well. So the entire community was invited to that. And we shared the recording and the Trello board for that. I should add links to that in here. So I'll take an action item because I forgot to add links to that. Okay. Yeah, so that was a really good conversation to have to kind of assess and analyze some of the things that went well and some of the things that we can improve. So we have a whole list of action items and things to follow up on there from that discussion to improve our process and to continue making progress on the Crossplane project more smooth and efficient. So normally we talk about the current status of the current milestone. But since the 0.3 release, we have started work on some items, but we're also in a bit of a planning phase as well. So I wanted to talk about one of the things that would make a big difference here in the next release is that we have been discussing increasing the release frequency and then also improving the process around releases as well. So we went entirely much longer than we would have liked to in between the last releases. 0.2 was sometime in like March or April, and 0.3 was in September. So that's a good number of months in between the releases there, and we want to turn that around completely and have a much more frequent release schedule. That has a number of benefits. One of them being that we'd be able to get new features and new things that we build into the hands of users in the community more frequently. So they wouldn't have to wait as long to be able to get an official release or a drop with new functionality that we build. But then also a big improvement that it provides is that it would decrease or lower the amount of stress and pressure for each release. Because if we're releasing on a very frequent frequency, then if something doesn't happen to make that release, then it could catch the next release train in the next period, which without waiting too long. So that stress or that pressure that builds up for doing a huge release that's multiple months in the making kind of dissipates, and that would be a lot better for the health of the community as well. So we're getting things into the users' hands more often and making it easier for contributors to get things in. So it seems to be goodness all around. One thing we were talking about is what the frequency of that should be. We normally run things on a sprint basis. Every 2 weeks, we plan out what the work items will be for that sprint and execute on them. We're considering doing a release at the end of every sprint, just all the features that we finish in that sprint, go ahead and cut a release from master and, keep master in sort of a, golden state there where, we ship entire features into master along with documentation and all full facets of the features completed. And then we'd be able to do releases from master on a very frequent basis, maybe even every single sprint. That may be a little much, maybe a little overhead with that. So we're considering also doing a monthly cadence. So that's still in debate a little bit. But one thing to note is that either way, that will increase the minor version counts of the Crossplane project in a much more rapid pace than it has in the past. 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, we're kind of slowly moving through those so far. If we release every sprint or every month, then that would rapidly go through 0.4, 0.5, those minor releases much more quickly, which is totally acceptable from from a semantic versioning perspective. That's the right thing to do. It's a little bit different, I guess, a different expectation than we put in the past, but that's something that I'm perfectly happy with in terms of getting things out to users more often. And the thing to note is that by doing minor releases of 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, that enables us to also do patch releases in between. If we release something to the community and we find a major bug in it that we want to fix, then we can do a patch release of a 0.4.1 in between. So that seems to be a good versioning scheme, and that's a follow-up that I'm working on right now of writing a proposal and writing that up about what our release process will be and how we can also increase the automation to make this more of a pain-free process that hit a button and the release goes type of thing to reduce the overhead for it. So that's where we are with releases. Phil has started an effort on planning towards the CubeCon San Diego timeframe, which is mid-November. We may have a number of releases in between there before San Diego, but that's about the planning scope that we're thinking of right now of what do we want to accomplish and be able to show off at CubeCon San Diego. Phil, this is your document that you started, this public planning document here. Do you want to talk through a little bit about what we're thinking of for that time frame and the planning process?
Yeah, totally. So we're really excited after kind of the v0.3 release to kind of adopt more of the rapid release schedule that Jared was just talking about. And so, we made some major strides in 0.3 and, moving infrastructure stacks out of tree, enabling additional stacks to be built more easily with the developer guide. And so we've seen actually a handful of additional stacks kind of sprout up now. And we're looking to do the same for initial Rook support so that I can basically provision in-cluster storage for things like Postgres databases from Rook providers like CockroachDB and Yugabyte from within Crossplane, so that I can basically do that in my own environment, whether it's on-prem or in a public cloud provider, using Rook in the same way that I would provision an RDS, a Cloud SQL, or a Azure DB. And so kind of getting that consistent experience with Crossplane. And so super excited about kind of the initial Rook support coming in as we're moving towards production for some key scenarios. As part of moving towards production use, getting the continuous deployment completely dialed in and having good working examples for some of the common pipelines or heavily used pipelines that are out there. So this includes both the traditional imperative pipelines like Jenkins and GitLab, as well as GitOps workflows like Argo CD and Reworked Flux. And so we have work in flight for that under 631 to basically provide those examples. Just to make it easier to get up and running and to show kind of, how we use Crossplane in our own continuous deployment environments that we're maintaining ourselves as well. So, and some really great work coming in 707 to provide a consistent apply of kubectl -f on a directory of YAMLs so that I can create my entire configuration for a cluster, for the networking, the subnets, firewall rules, everything that's needed to basically spin up an environment that I can deploy applications into and dynamically provision resources on demand. So, so that's basically kind of wrapping up now, I believe. And then we're going to, continue with the integration examples. Also, in terms of moving towards production use, getting to stable v1, beta 1 APIs, so that people feel more comfortable taking a hard dependency. We're currently v1 alpha 2 for most of our things in the out of tree stacks, and then the in tree stuff I believe is still v1 alpha 1. I'm not sure if that got bumped to be alpha 2 yet, but and so what we're looking at here is basically solidifying around a beta level meta model. It kind of has the base Kubernetes meta model for, you have a spec and you have a status and you have labels and selectors and things like that. But in terms of managing external resources, Crossplane has, kind of references and other patterns and, common attributes that basically can get standardized on across the stacks to make it easier to write stacks in a consistent way and that are easier to consume and understand by users that are consuming them. So looking to basically get the shape of those APIs and all the best practices that we've collected factored into that, and then getting rock solid high def CRDs and controllers for first and foremost databases and caches, so that it's totally a fine thing to do to go and take a hard dependency on that in this KubeCon milestone in your dev, test, and even prod environments. And so this will be the basis as well for code generation in the future. And so we probably won't get to code generation in the KubeCon timeframe, but with this in place, we'd be able to do that much more easily. So super excited about this work. Jared mentioned the release automation for shorter release cycles. So this is going to be following in all likelihood December 2.0.0 semantics, where you have like major, minor, patch. And so you'll see the version numbers likely getting bumped more rapidly there as we're releasing, minor versions with the ability to do hot patches, with the patch release, intra, minor release time frame. So we're kind of trying to dial in, do we want to do releases every 2 weeks or do we want to do monthly? So there's some internal discussion or community discussion around that. We'll probably land on one or the other. And we might try both in this time frame, with the first one being probably, like a 1 month release, and then we might go to 2 weeks after that and then make a decision on what cadence works the best. So UX improvements, streamlined user onboarding and enhanced support. So, as we've been going through the v0.3 release and kind of getting feedback from the community, there's some opportunity to make the experience even better. So ideas like a trace utility for enhanced debugging, better visibility into all the error messages, potentially using, events in Kubernetes. Things like resource packs where you can have, getting started templates for, the resource classes and the definitions that you could then go and customize, but you could otherwise keep control apply that directory to eliminate, that manual step. Then also looking at things like static provisioning examples, which is kind of a under-touted, capability that Crossplane provides, which is that you don't have to use claims and classes. You're welcome to just do static provisioning in a single namespace. And so, we got a, that was awesome. Was that like a progress meter? And then a buddy system for new users. So, doing some brainstorming yesterday, and for new users and contributors, just making sure that we have kind of a good process in place for making sure they're paired off with folks from the team to make sure that it's easier for them to get started more quickly and be effective. So that's kind of wrapping up, like moving to kind of more of a production readiness. And so then the next one is like, okay, more real world apps and scenarios. And so as we've all seen, we have GitLab deployed into multiple clouds already. We moved very quickly with the v0.3 release, and that example has not been kept up to date. So we need to kind of circle back and make that kind of work with the enhancements from v0.3. And then we have a new major initiative underway with template stacks, which is really focused on making it a lot easier to just build a stack. Today, you have to build a stack with KubeBuilder v2, and that's really, a pretty good experience, especially if you're doing like custom, infrastructure stacks, and you're comfortable kind of working in a Go environment. But to make this more accessible to a larger number of users that want to create their own stacks, basically creating template stacks that allow you to have kind of an on-disk, layout that says, here's the files that I want, and then being able to templatize those and install them in the same way that the KubeBuilder v2 based stacks do today with the Stacks Manager. So we're going to be having a design one-pager coming out for community review, and targeting likely an alpha release, an alpha or beta, depending, in the KubeCon timeframe. So super excited about this. It'll make it a lot easier to package up app stacks and publish those to the registry and consume them. And so that'll be really great. We've also had some discussion around some additional real-world apps. And so Concourse is one that keeps coming up, basically as a continuous deployment CI/CD type tool. And so, being able to deploy that so that people can use it in their environments, we felt like would be a great working example that could leverage a lot of what Crossplane supports today. We also have a handful of live apps that we're using in the community that we're going to start deploying with Crossplane, and ultimately want to get to a consolidated top 10 list of additional apps. So if you have your favorite app that you would like to see supported in Crossplane, drop us a line on Crossplane Slack, and that would be awesome. The other key thing with stacks is that, especially when you look at something like GitLab, where new releases are coming out every month, and you want people to be able to consume, like a stable version of that release, and then when a new release comes out, that you can, upgrade the stack, and the stack gives you the capability to upgrade your version of GitLab running in your environment. So if you think of the stack as effectively, the control plane that's basically managing, the application instances in an environment, you're really upgrading the capability of your control plane to provide lifecycle management of that app. And so Stacks versioning and upgrade basically just formalizes that, so that you can, just apply and upgrade to an existing installed stack, and then it can handle all of that for you in a more streamlined way. So definitely some important functionality there. So the last aspect that we're also super excited about is the GitLab Auto DevOps integration. So Auto DevOps basically are a set of auto-generated pipelines that GitLab does to do all kinds of stuff, including like the CI aspects in terms of like generating linting and static analysis and testing and all that kind of stuff. But then on the deployment side, they integrate with Kubernetes, and so you can connect any Kubernetes cluster and actually support even provisioning like a GK cluster in GitLab. And so this is all in their open source FOSS stuff. And so then we'll be able to install Crossplane as a GitLab managed app into that connected Kubernetes cluster to bring managed service provisioning to all of the app projects that are sharing that cluster. And so they basically have like a group level cluster where multiple app projects or repos really that basically can share that cluster each in their own namespace. And so admin can come in, install the Crossplane GitLab managed app, select the infrastructure stack that's most appropriate for the cluster that they've connected to GitLab for continuous deployment, and then go and set that up, and then onboard new app projects into the cluster, including making the Crossplane classes of service available for Postgres and Redis and buckets and so forth, so that you can go into, as an app project team member, you can go into your Auto DevOps Helm chart, which they use today to basically deploy continuously into these connected Kubernetes clusters. And then you can just, and in there today is just one attribute called, well, there is one attribute in there, there's a lot of attributes, but it's called Postgres enabled. And what that does today is basically says if it's set to true, it'll deploy an in-cluster container for Postgres, but it's not managed, it's not HA, it's not backed up or anything. It's just not really suitable for production. And so it's great for kind of, like a dev and a test environment, but, it's kind of needing something more. And so what Crossplane will add is the ability to drop in 2 additional attributes. So you can say Postgres enabled is true, and then Postgres managed is true. That will then drop a Crossplane claim into that app project's namespace, so that Postgres is dynamically provisioned using the default resource class in that app project namespace. And so with just 1 additional attribute, I can now get a managed Postgres instance. And that's super powerful. And so GitLab's super excited about it. They actually want to use it for their own purposes as well, because they use their own stuff. And so this would be useful to them and useful to their customers. And then we'll also support an additional attribute called Postgres class. And so then you can actually specify the specific class of service. Do I want a Postgres small or large or HA or standard, that type of thing. So really excited about this integration, kind of highlighting the power of managed service provisioning on connected Kubernetes clusters with Crossplane services. So yeah. And then down below, we just have the tentative release schedule. This is, currently in draft status, so feedback is welcome. But we kind of are moving to this faster release cycle or cadence. And so the first one is likely going to be 2 sprints, so V4 0.40, and then moving to 0.5 and then 0.6. We'll see how that frames up. So we might make 0.5, a monthly release, but this is the current plan. And then this basically takes us through CubeCon San Diego, which is how we got our milestone name. So yeah, that's basically the milestone planning that we have so far.
Awesome, Phil. What are we not building? That's a very comprehensive list of some really cool stuff. The team and the community has definitely grown, though, so there's lots of engineers to work on these problems here. But yeah, I love just the completeness and the breadth of this plan here. There's so many interesting things that we'll be able to advance and move the needle forward a little bit. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Okay, so that was kind of a state of where the project is with, where we are with planning and what we want to include over the next couple of releases, what we're thinking about our release process and everything. So I wanted to move then to the next sections here. There were a couple of pull requests or features that I wanted to bring up just to get a status or see if there's things we could do to move them along. But before that, were there any other community-related topics or anything about planning or milestones or anything like that anybody wanted to add that was not in the agenda documents? Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll move along then. So I wanted to see where we are. Is Javad on the call? Does not look like it. So Javad started an effort to move us from using the dep tool to manage a vendored set of dependencies to using the new Go module support that's built into the language and the Go tooling. I think that this one's been open for a little bit and some back and forth on that. I was hoping to check with Javad to see if it looks like we're converging. Bassam, I know that you had reviewed this recently in the build submodule to start supporting Go mods. Was there any big concerns here, or did you think that it was moving along?
I think it's moving along, and just there's a bunch of assumptions that the build, all these makefiles make that unfortunately are not very well documented, and so people making changes to it kind of just miss them. So we're going through that right now.
Got it. Awesome. Does anybody here have a lot of experience with Go modules so far? It seems like on some projects we've started to use that, and other ones not so much. Do people have good experience with Go modules so far?
I've enjoyed being able to remove the vendor directories from things, but I think haven't been including our vendor directory in main
Yeah, we
Crossplane.
don't commit it.
Yeah, but in general, it's worked out well. It does automatically bump up your O.O.O's, or like your O.O's, it will bump them up to the latest a little more frequently than I expected, coming from depth.
Mm.
So that's been fun. And I encountered that with Crossplane because when I tried to locally go through the same process and switch it to Go mod, it updated the version of the Go or of the Google client library to some newer version, and some of the calls that we were making had become deprecated. So you just have to be, I guess, careful about that.
Interesting. Okay, thanks, Marcus.
Yeah.
So I don't see Moafik or Nick on the call for the managed resource API pattern, so we could perhaps skip that. But Dan Mangum, do you want to give us an update on the effort that you've been putting in about adding support for Rook and in general Kubernetes native infrastructure providers?
Yeah, definitely. So there's a PR open, which is linked there in the doc, and that's a design document for Kubernetes native infrastructure providers, but specifically Rook, which is our main focus here. And then kind of at the end in future considerations, we call out how this may apply to other infrastructure providers that are Kubernetes native like Rook. I'd say the most significant kind of large impact of this design doc is the implementation of this Kubernetes provider type, which is one of the first things outlined in the doc. And what we're doing is, instead of only being able to, well, right now, the only thing that's provisioned on external Kubernetes clusters, so outside the Crossplane control cluster, would be Kubernetes application resources. And right now, the only way they're scheduled is by matching labels to a Crossplane provisioned Kubernetes cluster. So there's actually a Crossplane Kubernetes cluster object in the control cluster. And there's a scheduler controller for the Kubernetes application that essentially matches the labels and schedules in a round robin fashion. We're starting to shift that a little bit here with this proposal. Right now, we're not updating the Kubernetes application scheduling, but it will likely affect that in the future as well. But what this allows us to do is, just as you think of creating a provider to talk to GCP or AWS or any provider, we're basically creating one of those that allows us to talk to Kubernetes clusters, whether it's an external cluster provisioned by Crossplane, it's the Crossplane control cluster itself, or if it's just a bring your own cluster where you've had a cluster running maybe on-prem or something like that. We're now able to utilize all of these target clusters, which is a big increase in functionality, which is really nice. And we're going to start Rook with this sort of pattern. So any cluster running anywhere that you have Rook operators installed in, you can use that to provision Rook resources in. And the way the provisioning works is, typically with a more traditional cloud provider, you would create, let's just go with a static provisioning example. You would create a Kubernetes object that's like a Crossplane concept of that object. So maybe like an RDS instance. The controllers for that in the AWS stack would then create an RDS instance in AWS and reconcile it to the spec of that resource that you created. Now the concept with Rook or any other Kubernetes native infrastructure provider is the external resource is actually another Kubernetes object, a Rook Kubernetes object. So the example in this design doc is with a Cockroach DB cluster. So when you create, let's say, once again with static provisioning, you create a Cockroach DB cluster in Crossplane, then in the target cluster, wherever that is, where the Rook Cockroach DB operator is installed, it will create a Rook notion of a Cockroach DB cluster, and then it will use Rook's controller logic to actually create that Cockroach DB cluster in the target cluster. And then the reconciliation that's happening is actually between the Crossplane concept of the cockroach DB cluster and the Rook concept of it. So it can get a little bit confusing, but essentially it's just reconciling CRDs against each other. So it's actually a pretty simple workflow. And at the end of this document, there's some future considerations that call out potential to maybe kind of like consolidate some of this logic because it would be similar across. That's not necessarily in scope for this. What we want to do first is just be able to provision first Postgres database objects that can satisfy a Postgres claim in Crossplane. We want to be able to provision those using Rook. And then we want to expand to be able to provision all native resources that are supported by Rook. So that could be Minio, object stores, Ceph, EdgeFS, etc. Anything that Rook supports, we want to provide in the Rook stack. And then there's also some ideas for potentially building on top of that, which you'll see here, talking about buckets in an object store in Rook. We definitely want to support that in the future. It's not a native thing with Rook, so there's a couple of options for how we want to do that, but those are outlined there if you'd like to check those out.
Awesome, Dan. Thank you for driving that effort there. That's something that many people have been excited about for quite a while. We've been showing off hints of that functionality for a while now, so people are definitely excited about that scenario and being able to not only provision using Crossplane resources in all the cloud providers, but being able to provision resources and services on premises as well for new, on premises and hybrid scenarios. So I think that's super exciting. Thank you, Dan. Cool. So that was the end of the agenda items that I had on here for today. Were there any other things that folks wanted to discuss before we adjourned for the week? All right, then we will go ahead and wrap up this call here. Thanks everybody for joining the community meeting today, and we will see you online and then in 2 weeks at the next community call. Thanks everybody, bye.